Hello again, this is the Bunjee Venture by Stan Murtry and we're up to chapter 12. I just thought I would remind you, at the moment the last thing we heard was a and we know that that is Bunjee's, the sound of Bunjee's sucker feet. So I think he's stuck himself to the time machine, hasn't he? I just thought I'd remind you of some of the pictures that we've seen. There's Mr Winsborrow's time machine, the original, that he built on one leg. That's why it wobbled over. And his children, Andy and Karen, from the bits when it smashed, they rebuilt it but with 3 legs. Then do you remember Mrs Winsborrow? Oh my goodness. And the children, she was so upset and she kept on knitting and knitting and knitting and she had to blow her nose on it when she found that Mr Winsborrow had disappeared. She didn't know where he'd gone. But that knitting came in handy because that very long scarf was what Andy and Karen used to tie around the pterodactyl. And then if you remember, here's Bunjee, our lovable character, entering the story. And do you remember that Bunjee also has got a translucent trunk which he inflates, and you can see there he's got in his 4 suckered feet he's got 4 eggs, and they were stale eggs, and he smashed them together into the bloodsucker plant because Karen had been sucked into this plant here. Anyway, let's carry on. Police Constable 358 Arthur P. Sprocket shivered. The rain drizzled relentlessly down and he could feel it dripping from the back of his helmet onto the collar of his cape and down the back of his neck. He sighed and wished he was back at the station warming himself by the electric fire and sipping hot tea instead of being stuck here guarding an empty garage. Still, that's what the inspector wants, he thought to himself. 2 or 3 more sightseers had arrived and were goggling open-mouthed at the house. One of them even had a camera and was taking photographs of it. "Come along now, move along," said Constable Sprocket, walking down the short drive to the gate. "Nothing to see here." "Have they found those 2 poor little children yet?" said one of the people, an old lady with a large flowered hat. "Move along now," said Constable Sprocket again. "Who'd have thought that nice Mrs Winsborrow could have got rid of her husband and her 2 children like that?" said the woman. "I always said there was something sinister about her," said a man in a brown coat standing next to her. "She had shifty eyes." Constable Sprocket frowned. Now then, we have no proof that Mrs Winsborrow has disposed of her husband and children," he said. Then added the ominous word, yet. He waved his arm. "So, come along now, no more gossip, move away, please." The small group of people moved on down the street, muttering to themselves and pointing. I'm just distracted because Neil, my cat's just come in, and pointing back at the house. Constable Sprocket walked back through the drizzle and took up his position again outside the garage door. "A strange case," he thought to himself. "First of all, the husband disappears mysteriously 4 months ago, and his wife makes up some cock-and-bull story of a time machine exploding, and then the children disappear too, and the woman tries to make out that the same thing happened to them. She must think police are stupid." Inspector Bland came out of the house with 2 fingerprint experts, and Constable Sprocket sprang smartly to attention. Any luck, sir?" he asked. "Well, we've searched the house completely, 358, said the inspector, "but I'm afraid that we haven't come across any really good clues. We've searched the garden thoroughly too, nothing there." "What about the garage, sir?" Yes, we've had a look in there, of course. Empty apart from a lot of old bits of junk. We found some drawings of a strange type of machine, but she could have put them in there to try and make us believe her story." "Very crafty woman," said Constable Sprocket. "Very," agreed the inspector. Well, 358, you stay here and keep the Nose Parker sightseers away. I'm going back to the police station to see if I can get a confession out of Mrs Winsborrow. Right, sir, very good, sir. Leave it to me, sir, said Constable Sprocket. Just then, there was a knocking from the inside of the garage door. Pardon, 358, said the inspector. It wasn't me, sir, said Constable Sprocket. The knocking noise came again from the inside of the garage. I think it's coming from in there, sir, said one of the fingerprint men. It can't be. We've just searched in there and it was empty. Inspector Bland pushed past the constable, grabbed the door handles and opened the doors. Good gracious, said Andy. The police, what are you doing here? The 4 policemen stared, unable to speak, at the 3 Winsborrows. Inspector Bland's mouth had dropped open and a small gurgling noise came out of it. Yes, what are you doing here? Asked Mr Winsborrow as politely as possible. There was still no sound from the policeman. Inspector Bland tried to speak, but all he could manage was more gurgling. There was a shuffling sound from the darkness of the garage, and a huge, orangey red, hairy creature with a trunk and enormous bulging cheeks suddenly appeared in the doorway. Hello, it said. This looks like a nice place. This was altogether too much for the police. Ah! Said Inspector Bland. Mother, said Constable Sprocket. The 2 fingerprint men turned and ran. The inspector and the constable staggered backwards, goggle-eyed over the unkempt front lawn, and fell with a great splash into the fish pond. What's the matter with them? Said Bunjee. Meanwhile, back at the police station, Mrs Winsborrow sighed wistfully and went back to her knitting. The policewoman would be bringing her lunch soon, but she didn't feel much like eating. Not that the food wasn't nice, it tasted fine, and the policewoman had been very kind to her, but it was terrible being in a prison cell and really awful to be in there because they suspected her of having got rid of her husband and children. She looked around her bare little cell gloomily. How could they think such a thing? Her family were the most important thing in her life. She wouldn't harm them. Still, it must have seemed a pretty kind of odd story to the police. They must think I've gone off my rocker, going on about time machines, she thought to herself. Her needles clicked. The garment she was working on had started out to be a cardigan for the nice, kind policewoman who brought her meals, but somehow she was distracted by worry, and it had gone on, growing longer and longer with every day that she was kept in custody. It trailed over the cell floor, metre after metre of cardigan, until it covered practically every bit of floor space and would have been better used as a carpet. There was the sound of a key in the cell locked door. Oh, that'll be lunch, thought Mrs Winsborrow. The door opened. Inspector Bland, the man who'd arrested her, stood in the doorway. He was soaking wet. There he is, look. He was soaking wet. His hair was plastered down his forehead. Green pondweed hung like a necklace around his neck, and a lily leaf was perched on top of his trilby hat. He squelched into the cell. Mrs Winsborrow got the distinct impression... Come on then, Neil. Thank you. Got the distinct impression that he wasn't very well. Mrs Winsborrow, he said, I've got some rather good news for you. And that's the end of chapter 12. We've just got 2 more chapters now, which I'll read to you again soon. Okay, thanks very much for listening, and I'll see you soon. Thanks very much. Bye-bye now.